differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing. You see, amazing.
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
A Labour Party committed to weaning the United Kingdom off migrant labour. Are we through the looking glass, or is everything quite as it seems? Today on The Briefing, we're exploring Sir Keir Starmer's speech to the Confederation of British Industry, due to take place in around 15 minutes' time. Don't go anywhere. We'll explore it all after the headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. Energy suppliers have been named and shamed for failing vulnerable customers, with the regulator Ofgem saying there were problems across the board that urgently need to be addressed. A review found severe weaknesses at 5 companies: Good Energy, Outfox, So Energy, True Energy and Utilia. Ofgem says households are missing out on free gas safety checks, and firms aren't doing enough to identify those on prepayment meters who may need financial help. In total, 17 suppliers have been told they need to improve their approach to dealing with vulnerable customers. The UK must wean itself off migrant labour. That's the message the leader of the opposition is going to deliver to business leaders. Addressing the Confederation of British Industry, Sir Keir Starmer will say that the days of low pay and cheap labour must end, and that it's time to invest in training for those already in the UK. During his speech, he'll also promise to be pragmatic about the shortage of workers, saying if he gets into government, he's willing to accept increased skill immigration. Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds told GB News that immigration isn't the only way to fill the labour market.
The fact is the last 12 years have seen such a poor level of economic growth that, it doesn't deliver the living standards, the public services that the British people expect. And if we're going to resolve these, we've got to talk about issues like immigration. We've got to get the balance right. And I think what Keir has put forward today in his speech to the CBI is the right kind of balance. It is not saying immigration won't play a role in our economy, but it's just simply saying it's not the sole means of meeting those particular problems in terms of the labour market.
The number of people killed during the Indonesian earthquake has risen to 252. Western Java's local government says 377 people were injured when the 5.6 magnitude quake hit yesterday, and more than 7,000 people have now been displaced. 25 aftershocks have rocked the region, hampering rescue efforts. 31 people are still missing. Hundreds of schools in England have been downgraded by Ofsted. The watchdog inspected more than 500 schools in the last academic year. Of those that were re-inspected, only 17% retained their outstanding grade. Most of the schools were being assessed for the first time in over a decade due to an exemption from regular checks. The King is hosting his first state visit as sovereign this morning. His Majesty will welcome the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, during a ceremony at Horse Guards Parade in Whitehall. The event will also be attended by the Queen Consort and the Prince and Princess of Wales. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. You're up to date on GB News. Now let's go back to Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, it's a busy morning in politics today. The Prime Minister has just chaired Cabinet, a no doubt frosty meeting after a reported rift between the Prime Minister and Chancellor over EU relations. We can see the front door to Downing Street right now. Perhaps we'll be lucky enough to see some Cabinet Ministers sidle out of that meeting, where topics no doubt covered the Prime Minister's limited education-focused plan for innovation and growth, alongside, of course, that state visit of South Africa's President Ramaphosa. Perhaps also the issue of migration will be high on the agenda, as in just a few minutes' time, the Labour leader will be speaking to the Confederation of British Industry at their annual conference in Birmingham. Starmer will use his speech today to say that the UK must wean itself off migrant labour, flying in the face, on the face of it, of calls from the business community yesterday. Of course, as things stand, there are over 1 million job vacancies in the UK. How might they be filled? One detail, however, of Labour's approach that has escaped headlines this morning is this phrase, that, quote, any easing of restrictions must be matched by commitments from employers for better training, pay and conditions for homegrown staff. Now, that's an interesting point to raise that hasn't been picked up in these headlines so far. It's the Labour Party paving the way for eased restrictions on migration, despite the headline rhetoric, all in return for stronger working conditions. So perhaps these headlines aren't what they seem after all. But why does this all matter? Are we missing something far more fundamental in all of this? I've got a feeling that politicians of all parties are ignoring one of the most important issues that's facing our country: demographics. I want to show you the UK's population pyramid. Frankly, it's not in a good place and explains many of the difficult choices facing the United Kingdom today. Those watching on television should be able to see this chart of the United Kingdom's population up on our screens now. We're just working on getting that picture up for you right now. Now, the NHS has never had more money, yet care itself has never felt more stretched. Pensions are, of course, rising and working people are paying an ever higher share of income in their taxes. The tax burden has reached an all-time high on record. Now, why might that be the case? How do we have all of these different difficult situations? Why, indeed, are there 2 million job vacancies in the United Kingdom despite high migration? Well, here's a chart of the United Kingdom's population pyramid. And if you look very closely here, there is a bulge around the age of 60. Now, this bulge then is followed by a crash, a little rise, and then another crash. Frankly, what does all of this mean? That there are more older people reaching retirement, needing NHS care, needing pensions, and fewer younger people to pay for it all. Frankly, when there was a baby boom 60 years ago, we are now facing a baby bust. And what does this mean? That means fewer people are entering the workforce than we have enough to pay for those leaving the workforce. Unfortunately, our national insurance system is a bit of a Ponzi scheme. People feel like they've been paying into a pot that will then serve them in retirement. But frankly, they've been sold a lie. There is no pot. National insurance is current expenditure. People who paid into their pretend pot over years and years weren't saving for themselves. They were paying for the generation that was retiring at that time. And so we need to at least replace the population that we have at this stage in order to pay for those who are leaving the workforce. And frankly, our birth rate has been falling for years. And so we enter a lot of these problems. Perhaps instead of always reaching for the migration lever, politicians should think about our fertility crisis too. But let's now look to more about what the Labour Party leader may well be speaking about a little bit later. I'm delighted to be joined now by Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And Mark, I know that your institute was targeted yesterday by some environmental protesters. We'll come to that in just a second. But first of all, are you surprised to see on the front page of many newspapers this morning the Labour Party leader talking about restricting migration?
Yes, I am, Tom. It's quite an extraordinary turnaround, really, for the Labour Party. Keir Starmer's onto a point, I think, there. Something's going wrong in the British labour market. We've got jobs vacancies, but we've also got millions of people who are out of the workforce who could be in the workforce. To go back to your pyramid, Tom, that's not the people at the top who have already retired, but there seems to be quite a large number of people of working age who aren't going to take the jobs that are apparently available. Keir Starmer, however, appears to have reached the conclusion that this is because of a lack of training or a lack of skills. That's not obvious to me, really. I think it's more likely that we haven't got the right incentives in place to help these people get into work, to encourage them to actually work rather than stay at home. So it's slightly too easy for the domestic labour force to sit on their hands at the moment than it is to take jobs. I'm not totally sure that we should solve that by allowing in much more migrant labour, but there are jobs that need doing, and if we can't get Brits to do them, we probably need foreigners to do them.
It's interesting how many people decided, apparently over the course of the COVID pandemic, that furlough was actually quite nice, that perhaps they'd take a slightly lower income to sit back and do nothing. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why we saw so many people leave the labour force over the last 2 years. But clearly some people who were not at work yesterday were those who decided to deface your offices, throwing black paint over your door. What was going on there?
Tom, I wish I knew. I was in my office holding a meeting at 11 o'clock yesterday morning when I noticed a flare had gone off and there was some commotion outside the front door of the Institute of Economic Affairs. A handful of environmental protesters, I gather they're part of Extinction Rebellion, had seen it fit to cause criminal damage to our property. They had a slogan saying we should cut our ties to fossil fuels. I'm not quite sure what the demand is. I don't know how these people got to my office, probably by the use of fossil fuels. And they set off, as I said, a flare, not obviously good for the environment, and splashed black paint all over our door. Not a particularly extravagant piece of performative street art because our door is black anyway. So that was a slight irritation. I'm very interested to debate people from Extinction Rebellion. And actually, less than a year ago, I held a round table at the IEA. We invited some of them in to talk about what to do about climate change. What should the approach be? They seem to have got into their head that myself or others at my institute deny that climate change is happening or are insistent that we should try and accelerate climate change. I'm very interested in solving it, but I don't think the best way of working out the solution is to have a handful of people with time on their hands throwing paint on somebody's door. The police arrested 2 of them, I believe. I don't know whether they've been charged. I hope they are, because I don't think this is a particularly pleasant way to behave. If you want to go and throw paint at people's doors, expect to be charged and fined. And obviously we're considering whether we'll take civil action against any of the protesters for the damage they've caused our building.
It does seem extraordinary that these groups seem to, just by second nature, willingly cause criminal damage to property. Throwing paint, smashing windows is another one. Illegality is second nature to these groups, and yet they sort of continue to function. Some of them have corporate structures. How's that allowed?
Well, I'm OK with Extinction Rebellion having a corporate structure. It's a slightly oblique corporate structure, I think. The IEA's corporate structure is a lot clearer, as is GBNews. You know who to sue if Tom, you make a big error or I make a big error. I think there is a problem, which we've seen, of course, with quite a lot of the Just Stop Oil protests, when people sort of glue themselves to the streets or gum up the M25, that there doesn't seem to be much of a penalty involved. Now, I don't want to overstate this. This handful of slightly ludicrous people outside of my office door yesterday didn't, chill us with fear within the IEA. We were, slightly confused and slightly amused, but it is criminal activity. In credit to the police force, they turned up, they arrested 2 of them. We'll see what happens next. But if there's no penalty for committing criminal offences, such as throwing paint all over somebody's door, then people will go to keep doing it as a piece of protest, performative street art, as I was saying. So I hope there is a penalty. I'm not saying that they should be thrown in prison for years, but I don't know, a week in prison and a few £100 fine, that might deter them again in future. So I think it is incumbent both on the police force and our legal system not to be too heavy-handed here, but right across the country in a myriad of ways they seem to have been very, very light-handed. I can't say whether that's happened yet with regard to the attack on the Institute of Economic Affairs yesterday. We'll see. I'm hoping to hear that some of these people have been charged. I presume they will get a criminal record. I'd like to see them fined, and I'd like to recoup a little bit of the money to repair the door. It's only a few £100, something like that, but nevertheless, people should face the consequences of their actions. And my general experience to date is they haven't been.
Yes, it seems that so many of these people are repeat offenders as well. Now, Mark, do forgive me if I interrupt you any minute now, because we are expecting Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour Party leader, to start speaking in the next minute or two. But just if you were leading the Labour Party in this funny parallel universe we're constructing now, what would you be saying to the Confederation of British Industry this morning?
Well, I'll give some credit to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves that I think they have actually moved the Labour Party into a position in which business will sort of listen to them and take them seriously. This is often a problem for the Labour Party. Are you taken seriously on the economy? Can business trust you to run a pro-enterprise economy? And Keir Starmer has to address that particular problem, that thorny issue, that dilemma, as of so many of his predecessors. So what I'd love to hear from him, and what I would do if I was him, would be to sketch out a programme to the CBI, a plan that a Labour government would be good for business, would encourage enterprise, not stifle it, would not try and milk entrepreneurs dry, would not attempt to believe that everything that good can be done in Britain could only be done by the state, but an awful lot of good can be done by business if it's given the opportunity to breathe. I think if Keir Starmer actually gets that message across, we might see the full shift away from Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, in which the default position was all the things that we want in Britain will be delivered by the government, to something a little bit more Blairite. Keir Starmer seems to be on that journey. I hope he takes a few more steps down that path and shows that the Labour Party isn't just about Labour, isn't just about workers and their rights, but is about business, enterprise, corporations, investment, and actually growing the entrepreneurial private sector side of our economy too. If he gets that message across, well, I guess a good number of people might conclude that he could be the next Prime Minister.
It is interesting to see that, particularly on some areas of supply-side reform, the Labour Party might be appearing now more pro-market than the Tory party. During her brief premiership, Liz Truss, of course, reversed the David Cameron ban on new wind farms being built in the United Kingdom onshore. Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister and promptly reinstated that ban. The Labour Party is making quite a big show about wanting to repeal that ban again, about letting the market work, letting the market build. I suppose that's a more pro-market case on that area than the Tories have.
Tom, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I'm finding it really difficult to work out what the actual policy differences are between the Labour front bench and the Conservative government. You and your viewers might take a view on who you think are the more competent managers or better on television or the rest of it. But in terms of policy, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of difference between the Conservatives and Labour. And you make a very fair point that in some areas you might argue that the Labour Party is actually more pro-market. If you were to look at tax policy, I think there's virtually no difference between the two parties. The Labour Party has literally shadowed the various decisions that the Conservatives have made and unmade over recent weeks, both under the Truss administration and now the Sunak administration. And in terms of actually liberating business, in terms of removing red tape, in terms of allowing things to happen, you mentioned wind farms, Tom, but you might take a similar view on, say, planning reform more generally. What can we build? What will we allow to be built? The Conservatives at the moment seem to be unbelievably restrictive and prescriptive and unable to allow the market to flourish. I'm not going to hold up the Labour Party as an icon of sort of free market liberalism, but in a number of these areas around regulation and restraint, perhaps actually the Labour Party will be somewhat more market liberal than the Conservatives. An extraordinary position in this very toxic world of political debate where you would think that there was huge amounts at stake and all politicians hate each other because of the enormous principal differences between them. I can't find very many differences between the Conservatives and Labour.
After listening to the autumn statement, I think it was only last week, it feels like a lot longer since then, I was trying to find the differences between the Tories and the Labour Party on tax policy. Because, of course, both parties promote now windfall taxes. The Tories went even further than the Labour Party in terms of making more people pay the very top rate of tax, the additional rate. I think the only differences on policy on tax is the Labour want to tweak the rules around non-DOMs, a tiny number of people, and make private schools pay VAT. Other than that, it's basically exactly the same. Are we entering an era where there isn't enough difference between our two major parties?
I think that might be right. Way back in the 50s and 60s, Tom, it was considered there was a consensus around what was called Butskillism. This was an inelegant merger of the surname of Rab Butler, a leading Conservative, and Hugh Gateskill, who was the leader of the Labour Party. So it was called Butskillism because you couldn't put a cigarette paper, really, between the Conservatives and the Labour Party back in the 50s and 60s. And we seem to be there again now. You're right, there are differences in policy, but not colossal ones. What neither party's facing up to, though, neither the Conservatives nor the Labour Party, is if we're at the taxable limits of the economy, and if actually the only arguments between the two parties are a slight tweak here or a slight tweak there, we need to have a serious discussion about spending priorities and how we can get government spending down. Because for 20 years now, governments of all stripes, coalition, Labour, Conservative-led, have run budget deficits, and the national debt is going up and up and up. So we need to have a serious discussion about what are we going to prioritise? Is it going to be triple locked pensions? Is it going to be welfare benefits going up with inflation? Is it going to be the NHS? Is it going to be completing High Speed 2, this railway line? Is it going to be the police force? Is it going to be defence? Take your pick, but we can't have all of them. Somewhere we're going to have some priorities and say, we're going to spend on A, B and C, but a bit less on D, E and F. Neither the Conservative Party nor the Labour Party seem willing to have that discussion at the moment. But as a matter of sheer economic maths, whoever forms the government over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years are going to have to make those decisions. And I would welcome both parties actually having a discussion about that in public, rather than just sort of sitting on their hands and waiting for a bleaker tomorrow, which in terms of spending seems to be the approach of both of the main parties in Britain. And that's rather depressing. I'd much rather have a discussion now about how we trim our cloth and what really are our spending priorities, because you would think, listening to both parties, that everything is a spending priority. And if everything is a spending priority, then nothing really is.
Well, I have to say, we've been talking about how similar both parties now are on economic matters, and indeed talking about how really you're going to have to decide in terms of competence between these parties instead of policy. Well, in terms of timing, at the very least, Keir Starmer is not showing a lot of competence this morning. He was meant to start speaking around 10 minutes ago at the CBI and still hasn't turned up yet. We'll have to end it here and indeed move on to the next show. Hopefully we'll pick up Sir Keir Starmer's words with Bev Turner today. That's on next. But thank you very much to Mark Littlewood of the IEA for joining me there. That's it for the show today. Of course, stay with GB News whenever Sir Keir Starmer does decide to start speaking. We will show you that then.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
On the Mark Stein Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the
Britain. How together we can build a fairer, greener, more dynamic country. A nation where working people succeed, where aspiration is rewarded. A Britain with its confidence, its hope and its future back. I come with a simple message. Labour is ready. Ready to give Britain the clear economic leadership it needs. Ready to work with you to drive our country forward. Not just a pro-business party, but a party that is proud of being pro-business, that respects the contribution profit makes to our jobs, growth and our tax base, that gets that working people want success as well as support, understands that backing private enterprise is the only way Britain pays its way in the world. And mark my words, this is a matter of conviction for me, and I've united my party behind it. Anyone who came to our conference this summer, anyone I've met since being leader, more than 100 CEOs in the last 6 months alone, knows this already. This is a different Labour Party, and there's no going back. We're ready for partnership. And let's be frank, because we need to be. Partnership is not a nice to have, it's now an economic imperative. I don't want to waste too much time today talking about the government, but the economic damage they've done to our country is immense. They've put our public finances in a perilous position, wasted the chance to transform our potential in an era of low interest rate, created an economy with weak foundation. This isn't about global shock. That's just an excuse. Nobody criticises the government for not anticipating the war in Ukraine or denies the war was the spark for the cost of living crisis. But the war didn't ban onshore wind, the war didn't scrap home insulation, and the war didn't stall British nuclear energy. And when it comes to economic growth, the verdict of the former Chancellor is right. They've created a vicious cycle of stagnation. And that's why every crisis hits Britain harder than our competitors. The only country in the G7 still poorer than it was before the pandemic. Disposable income back to 2013 levels. the worst decade for growth in 2 centuries. That's why we need a new partnership. Economic growth is the oxygen for our ambition, the lifeblood of a strong society and a dynamic economy. But we have to confront the reality of our position. The lessons of the past 12 years can't be ignored. Just stop for a moment and think what working people have been through. They were told, we're all in it together. Then they paid for a mess made by banks. They cried out for economic change in a referendum, but saw their calls go unanswered.